Thank you so much. So part of this program is definitely the fashion show, which will be happening shortly. But I want to talk a little bit about our beloved Jane Austen. And before I do that, I want to find out who I'm talking to here. How many of you have read at least one Jane Austen novel? Two? Three? All of them? Okay. And how many of you have seen one or more of the movie adaptations? Okay, great. So we might have some people who know more in here than I do, but that's absolutely okay. You'll add to the ongoing discussion. So I want to start with just talking a little bit about Jane's literary legacy, 200 and going into 251 years at this point. You may know all of her novels. Her juvenilia included Love and Friendship, The Beautiful Cassandra, Leslie Castle, and Lady Susan. Then she wrote Sense and Sensibility in 1811. Pride and Prejudice followed in 1813. Mansfield Park in 1814, and Emma, 1815. And Persuasion, as well as Sanditon, which was unfinished and unpublished, but Persuasion was published posthumously in December of 1817. And you may know sadly, Jane died at the early age of 41 in July of 1817, 42, sorry. So who knows what she would have accomplished had she lived a little longer. But like, yeah, shorter versions, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about Jane, and we are all products of our environments. We're products of our families. Her endurance as a novelist is remarkable, really, considering that she didn't live into old age. But she was a small town gal. I mean, she grew up in a small parish of Steventon in 1775. London was about 60 miles away, which by horse and carriage was 3 hours, and probably not that comfortable. She did visit there on several occasions because her brother Henry lived there, and she did shop for fabric there, we do know. There was a store called Grafton House, which was a very famous fabric and accessories house for women of the period. She also traveled to the resort town of Bath, and she later lived there. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But she visited in 1797 and 1799 as a young woman, and then she did live there from 1801 to 1806. And then she spent the last 8 years of her life in Chawton. And Winchester is where she died in 1817. Just to show kind of the provincial nature of her life, the little dot is Steventon here. This is where she was born. This is where her father and mother settled. Her father, George Austen, was the pastor of the Steventon parish. This is London over here. Again, the distance of 60 miles, but 3 hours. Bath was sort of the equidistant on the western side. And then down here is Chawton, and where she sort of settled after her father died, and they could no longer afford to live in Bath. So her world was rather small when you think about how we live today. But she was not provincial in the sense of her brain, because her home with her father was very print rich. There were periodicals, I'm sure, of the day. There were what probably weren't called magazines, but lots of things to look at and lots of things to read. Her father had a very extensive library and was not stingy about helping her learn. So he was pretty ahead of his time in terms of men for the day as well. So though she lived in a small radius, it was also the most populated area of England at the time, and probably still is. When I Googled it, London has over 9 million people alone today. So again, Steventon to Bath, 67 miles, 3 to 4 hour carriage ride, just to kind of give you a little perspective on her world. So Her father, as I mentioned, was a pastor. They did not make a whole lot of money, probably around 400 to 600 pounds a year, which was hardly enough to, have a real extravagant lifestyle. But what they made up, what they did not have financially, they made up for in intellect. And again, George Austen, her father, was quite an intellectual, as well as a pastor, which often came together in those days. Steventon had a population in 2024 of 250 people. So that kind of gives you an idea back in the 1800s what Steventon might have looked like. Very, very small town. So when she was growing up, and George was an Oxford-educated minister, so I think that also ties in with being an intellectual and sharing that intellect with his children. The home was full of books, and Reverend Austen was an inspiring teacher for Jane. Both Jane and Cassandra were sent to boarding school, which is another indication that the family valued education. They went to the Reading Abbey Girls' School in Berkshire, which was about 26 miles from Steventon. And that was 1785 and 1786. Jane was 10, and Cassandra, her sister, they were very close, had come home after a year because they both had a serious case of typhoid, which was pretty common during that day. But they were not able to finish their schooling there. But I know from what Jane has written about the school, it was a very positive experience for them both up until that point. So, you asked the question, well, what was her financial ability to indulge herself in beautiful, fashionable clothing and accessories? Not much. But Jane had a lot of smarts, not just about writing, but she had a lot of clever ways of putting things together, so to speak. And even though in her lifetime, her monetary salary from publishing all 4 novels was 684 pounds, that's $64,000 in today's currency, a little over. So this would have been a considerable, adequate amount of money for an unmarried woman in her social circles. Society's expectation in accepting a low standard of living for an unmarried woman was that some man in her world would take pity and help them survive on a poverty level income, which is what Jane had. And in fact, this was often the case. And in Jane's case, that's exactly what happened. Her father dies in 1805 in Bath. They go to live in 1801. And I think Bath had a very long history with the family. George Austen and his wife were married in Bath. They honeymooned in Bath, and he was ultimately buried in Bath. So there was this familial relationship that the Austens had with Bath. And I think Jane adored it and at times was annoyed by it because, let's not forget, she really was a small town country girl. And Bath at that time had 40,000 people. That's in 1800. 1810 was the first census that England did, and there were 40,000 people in Bath at that time. So it was not a small town. It was bustling. And it was also the home of the rich and famous at that time. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the father dies in 1805. They're all living in Bath. Jane, her mother, Cassandra, and Martha Lloyd, who is another friend that actually ends up marrying one of her brothers. But so she was 30 when her father died, and up to this point, she still lived with her mother and father, whose income was about 200 pounds a year, of which she received about 20 pounds. So we're not dealing with someone who had a lot of extra cash to spend on beautiful clothing. And it was even more stretched post her father's death in 1805. The saving grace was her brother Edward had been adopted by a wealthy family, the Knight family, which you may have heard this. and inherited a solid estate of £15,000 a year, which was huge in 1812. His contribution to Jane was the ability to live rent-free in Chawton Cottage, which was located on his Chawton estate. So you had the Chawton House, which is where Edward lived, and Chawton Cottage was on that same estate, and that's where Jane, her mother, Martha Lloyd, and Cassandra lived post their father's death. And the rest of the financial needs were taken care of by the other brothers. She had another brother, James, who was a clergyman, again, about £600 a year. And then she had two naval brothers, Charles and Frank. And if, again, naval pay depended on whether it was wartime or not. And when you look at Jane's lifetime and all of the battles and skirmishes and spy activity that was going on, it was no picnic to be alive during Jane's time politically. You may remember the guy Napoleon. You know, I mean, he was doing all kinds of things to terrorize the English and a lot of other countries as well. I recently we went to Europe and had the opportunity to visit Waterloo Museum. Fantastic if you ever have the chance to see that. It's really quite amazing. And the fact that all that was going on in Jane's lifetime was pretty interesting to me. But it was also, you know, wartime was the way that a lot of men made their fortunes. I mean, when you think about Captain Wentworth in Persuasion, he was an example of that, and she wrote that into her novels. So there was just, it's amazing she didn't write more about the political turmoil. And a lot of people criticized Jane Austen for that, but I think her work was probably more escapism than anything else. She had two brothers in the military, and there was a lot going on. So sure, there was a lot of fear and anxiety about their lives on a rather daily basis, perhaps. So her financial capability, she had in 1810 an annual income of about £55 a year, which was considered to be at poverty level even then. And overall, it averaged about £40 per year in her life. That, you know, she was a product, like so many talented women of her day. The royalties from all the movie adaptations of her novels would have made her quite a wealthy woman today, but that was not the case during her lifetime. Oh yeah, I just write that thing about Jackie Collins, who wrote 30 books in the 80s and 90s, as well as several miniseries adaptations, had a net worth of 150 million when she died in 2015. So anyway, this is Chawton House. This is where Edward Knight, her brother who was adopted by the Knight family, this is one of the estates that he inherited from the Knight family. Just a little cottage at the edge of the forest. And this was Chawton Cottage, where Jane lived here the last 8 years of her life, and this is where she wrote all her novels. Her little desk still exists in this house. It is now a Jane Austen House Museum in Chawton in England. Haven't been there yet, but it's on my bucket list for sure. So before Chawton Cottage, there was Bath. And as I said, her parents were very fond of Bath. It was part of their history, family history. It was their wedding. You know, it was just a place that had a lot of lore. So one of the things, there are a few quotes here from Northanger Abbey that Jane says, "I really believe I shall always be talking of Bath when I am at home again. I do like it so very much. Oh, who can ever be tired of Bath?" And I think that was one way that Jane did see Bath. She loved it there. There was lots of activity, lots of notes for her to take on the rich and famous that she could use in her novels later. And then she also says, "For 6 weeks, I allow Bath is pleasant enough, but beyond that, it is the most tiresome place in the world." So I think on the other hand, there was that, you know, it's like New York City. I mean, I lived there for 40 years, but, you know, now going back, I'm like, oh no, not this again. But I think, you know, for a country girl, it was, you know, it was quite exciting, and then it wore off a little bit. But the beauty of Bath is well known. yeah, I say, what's not to love? It is the site of a lot of Roman, old Roman ruins and baths, uh, mineral baths that the rich and famous flocked to for their health certainly during Austen's time and probably even beyond that. I don't think the baths exist today. I'm not quite sure about that. But it is still a lovely destination in England. So the influence on young Jane, she lived in Bath with her family from 1801 to 1806. Her father retired there, and that's why they moved there. And because, again, the thermal springs and the social scene, Bath had developed in one of the most fashionable spa destinations in Europe, drawing the upper echelons of British society and probably every other country on the mainland there. With them, their wardrobes, their habits, their manners, their customs, and I really think that Jane was, like many writers, a sponge for what was happening around her. And I think she did absorb a lot of what was happening in Bath. I think it had a tremendous effect on her writing. The fact that she didn't start writing till after she had that experience. I think she was taking copious notes the entire time. She was 26 when she arrived, and she was or 31 when they left. That also is a very formidable time in a person's life. So I'm sure that she and Cassandra had, her sister, Cassandra, 2 years older than she was, had long discussions about fashions and what they saw in the course of a day at Bath. So she loved it by many accounts, and she embraced everything about it. Here are some more quotes. The first view of Bath in fine weather does not answer my expectations. I think I see more distinctly through the rain. And in 1801 letter to Cassandra, I get more and more reconciled to the idea of moving to Bath. We have lived long enough in this neighborhood. You know, time to shed the dust of the small town and move to Bath. And it did find its way in her published works, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, which are both centered around Bath. That this is true, yes. And I think that Anne Elliot may have embodied some of Jane's feelings, but then there are other characters who can't stop talking about Bath, you know, in a positive way. But by all accounts, it is an absolutely gorgeous city then and still is today. So the first, as I mentioned before, the first census in England was 1801, and at that time there were 40,000 people in Bath. And before moving to Bath, Jane had spent some time as a tourist there, and I think it had a huge effect on her and impression on her. We know that she shopped for fabric in Bath in 1799, and because she didn't have a whole lot of money to have a modiste or a mantua maker make all her dresses, what Jane became very adept at doing was taking older dresses and making them look new, you know, bringing them up to date or adding a trim here and there. She was, by all accounts, a very skilled seamstress, as many women were in that day. You had to be. And I think she probably didn't have the money to spend a lot on her clothes, but what she did do was relevant and was able to keep up to date. She mentions some gauzes at only 4 shillings a yard, but they were not so good or so pretty as mine. So she was comparing what she already had with what she saw in the stores. And when I say her creative genius went beyond the written word, I do believe that she, as a designer, had some skills. She was all too aware of her financial status. You know, it wasn't until she settled down in Chawton Cottage that she was able to start writing. I mean, up to that point, you know, they were living in Bath, money was tight, the father dies, what do? You know, they're dependent on that. You know, it was really when she got to Chawton Cottage, where she lived out the last 8 years of her life, I think maybe she was just able to sit and concentrate now on what was happening, you know. We all know it's hard to concentrate when you're stressed or anxious or, you know, so anyway, I think Chawton Cottage was the perfect place for her to sort of collect her thoughts on all the experience she had had up to that point. So in 1801, after arriving in Bath, she writes to Cassandra, "I find my straw bonnet looking very much like other people's and quite as smart." So she was comparing herself to what she saw in Bath, and I'm sure she saw a lot. And then, "We must turn our black pelisses into new, for velvet is to be very much worn this winter." And that was a letter to Cassandra in 1808. "I have determined to trim my lilac sarcenet with black satin ribbon, just as my china crepe is 6, I think that's, I forget what the D stands for, but anyway, it's like inches, I think, at the bottom." So she was getting into very detail. This is what designers do. And the ribbon trimmings are all in fashion at Bath, and I dare say the fashions of the two places are alike enough in that point to content me. With this addition, it will be a very useful gown, happy to go anywhere. So as I said before, she was a gifted seamstress. Her niece Caroline Austen wrote, "She was a great adept at overcast and satin stitch, the peculiar delight of the day." And her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, actually said her needlework, both plain and ornamental, was excellent and might also have put a sewing machine to shame. So, you know, Edward Austen was a generation or 2 generations later, but it was kind of legendary, her sewing. So this is actually the only wearable extant garment that we have of Jane Austen's. It's a robe. It's made of silk. What we know about it is the only surviving body garment associated with Jane, on point with fashion trends of the time, circa 1812 to 1814, gifted by the Austen family descendant to the Hampshire County Museum Services, so you can see it in Hampshire County Museum and Archives. Made from English manufactured twilled sarcenet silk, Persian silk lining, sewn with yellow silk thread. She obviously had this made. She did not make this herself. She did have someone to make her clothes. There is evidence that Jane not only had a dressmaker, they sent their laundry out to be done as well. So landed gentry, no matter how poor you were, it had some little pleasures that went with it. This has a ruche self fabric trimmed around the collar, pattern of oak leaves, which was popular patriotic motif during the Napoleonic Wars. And it was open in the front with no fasteners. So I want to point out, anybody who's real geeky about Jane Austen's clothes and that time period, this is a fantastic book by Hilary Davidson called Jane Austen's Wardrobe. She's written a couple of different books. This is a really great book, very detailed book about Jane's clothes. And based on the measurements taken in the recreation of Jane's silk pelisse, which Hilary Davidson did, it was very interesting. She came up with the following proportions for Jane. 5'7" to 5'9", 34-inch bust, 24-inch waist, 34-inch hips. When I researched measurements of today's top runway models, these exact measurements are what I found. Jane had the proportions of some of today's top models. Pretty amazing. I thought that was really interesting. Obviously, the concept of beauty in that day was a little different, and these are just some examples of pelisses of the period. You'll see some in a minute in person, but it was an overgarment that was worn with a chemise underneath or a gown underneath, usually for outer wear. So, you know, Jane was described in a lot of different ways by different people. Not always flattering. A thin, upright piece of wood or iron. Tall, thin, spare person with very high cheekbones. Tall and slight, but not drooping. Slight and elegant. And 1791, cousin Eliza writes that she hears that Jane and Cassandra, her sister, are perfect beauties and, of course, gain hearts by dozens. Hardly the way you'd describe a frump. And was she obsessed with her clothes? Well, despite her income Jane had her clothes made from local dressmakers, and as I said, they went out to be laundered as well. Miss Summers was one of these dressmakers near Stevenson who spent 11 days creating a dress from fabric, which both Jane and Cassandra had bought. There was much back and forth whether Cassandra was having buyer remorse. I think this is really interesting. This is letters between Cassandra and Jane from November to December of 1800. Your abuse, this is Jane, your abuse of our gowns amuses, but does not discourage me. I shall take mine to be made up next week, and the more I look at it, the better it pleases me. And then a week later, I cannot this is Jane again, I cannot possibly oblige you by not wearing my gown, because I have it made up on purpose to wear a great deal, and as the discredit will be my own, I feel the less regret. You must learn to like it yourself and make it up at Godmersham. It may easily be done. It is only protesting it to be beautiful, and you will soon think so. Now, remember, this is the same fabric they bought. So this two sisters buying the same fabric, making a gown out of the same fabric. I think Cassandra maybe had some feelings that, do I really want a dress that looks just like my sister's? I don't know. But anyway, they were having this conversation. And now the dress is finally done. Miss Summers has made my gown very well indeed, and I grow more and more pleased with it, says Jane. And once the gown was made, Jane got several opinions about it, of course, and Martha Lloyd, who lived with them, said she is pleased with my gown and particularly bids me say that if you could see me in it for 5 minutes, she is sure you would be eager to make up your own. So she's still prodding her sister to make up the gown. She just can't rest until Cassandra has a gown just like her. It's very interesting. They were quite close, the sisters. Out of probably thousands of letters, we have 165 letters of Jane's to her sister, to other people. It's too bad we don't have more. These are just some examples of costumes of the day. And she definitely had opinions on fashion as well. In 1808, Jane's new cloak, and I don't think it's the one we saw, maybe it could be, she says, it is too handsome to be worn, almost too handsome to be looked at. I mean, it could be the same one, because why, it has survived for 250, 240 some years. If somebody was wearing it a lot, it might not still be here, but she writes to her friend, Martha, I'm amused by the present style of female dress, the colored petticoats with braces over the white spencers and enormous bonnets upon full stretch are quite entertaining. So she was not a woman who did not admire fashion, and she actually quite enjoyed it. And we have a lot of references of Jane shopping for fabric in London and in Bath as well. In 1813, she writes, we must have been 3/4 of an hour at Grafton House, Edward sitting by all the time with wonderful patience, that's their brother. The edging there is very cheap. I was tempted by some, and I bought some very nice plating, which is like pleating lace. So, a woman who's not concerned about fashion or not concerned about looking relevant for the time period does not spend the time like Jane spent, reworking her clothes, talking about her clothes and thinking about fashion. This is a typical fabric store of the time. See these huge bolts streaming down where customers would choose. Just a quick note on the pictures we have of Jane. I mean, she was born in 1775, so obviously cameras were not around. One of the few pictures we have of her is this one, which was a watercolor done by her sister, Cassandra, in 1804. This was done in Bath, when they lived in Bath, and it is one of only 2 uncontestable portraits in existence of Jane, both of which Cassandra did. But there's not much you can glean from this, except maybe she liked the color blue. You know, she is relevant for the period. She is wearing a very typically fashionable style for the period, including the hat. She looks like she could be very tall there in a way, or leggy actually. But other than that, not a whole lot we can glean from that. And then the other one is another watercolor that Cassandra did in 1810. And the original is 4.5 inches by 3 1/8 inches. So, and it's not that easy to, actually a pencil drawing, I think. Pencil and watercolor. Again, it's not a whole lot we can glean from it. A lot of people have played with this image over and over and over again and embellished it. But that's the original there on the left. And again, it was small then. I think that's located in maybe the British Museum. And then there was one more that was done of Jane when she was 14 in 1789. Her great uncle Francis commissioned this, Ozias Humphrey. So in terms of knowing what she looked like, it's hard to say, but people have a lot of thoughts about it. And, it's like anyone else from the past that we admire, and yet we can't really grasp so many things about them because they grew up in a time that we have little knowledge about, a little bit here and a little bit there. But what's fun is sort of delving into it and coming to your own conclusions. But we do know that her literature lives on, and we enjoy it. And it just seems to get more and more popular every day. I know that the Jane Austen Society of North America continues to grow, and here in Maine as well. We really enjoy our teas, and there's a ball coming up in Topsham on May 23rd. There's a spring tea up in Winter Harbor. So if anyone's interested in being on our mailing list, please let me know. We have a lot of fun talking about Jane and learning about Jane's world. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We are going to, is our first model out? Okay. We're going to get right into our fashion show. These designs are, for the most part, my own. They are also made from patterns, for the most part. And I have a wonderful, good time making them. I started making them in 2017, I think. And I just can't stop. So I just love putting it all together. So we're going to show some of those to you this evening. And Mary Lou Barker is our first model. She is wearing a green silk gown with a green striped Spencer jacket. With it, she's wearing a Regency style hat, which was called a bag hat, and she's carrying a green reticule with embroidery. We will see Mary Lou in a minute. Thank you, Mary Lou. Next, we have Hannah de Rispino wearing a bright pink silk gown with a lace Spencer jacket. She has a Regency style cap and carrying a Regency reticule. This is not Hannah's first fashion show. She has been to Ellsworth Public Library for our first fashion show Hannah was in. And she also did her own hair, probably very much like they did it in the period with rags. She did it last night, so beautiful job, Hannah. Jean Pike from Winter Harbor is wearing a blue cotton pelisse over an off-white chemise. This is Jean's first fashion show, but she's got it down. She's wearing what would have been called a tall hat. Back then they had no sunglasses. That was not created yet. So hats were very important to keep the sun off your face. The pelisse was a very common garment, both for warmth and for just style as well. Mary Post is quite the inspiration. She makes her own Regency gowns. She made this lovely turquoise velvet Spencer jacket with frog trimming enclosures, which were very popular during the day. And her gown is a polished cotton. And she carries a pink reticule. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Cotton was a very common fiber, both from India, and they also started manufacturing it in England not long after Jane's time. Maureen Jennings is wearing a brown silk gown with a gold striped pelisse. Quite a stunning combination. With a black furry muff, which were also very popular during the day. These fabrics are sourced, thank you, Maureen, excellent. The fabrics are sourced in a variety of places, including our very own Martin's from time to time. Martin's had a big sale on silk one year, right before I retired, and I bought up a bunch. I said, well, you're retiring, you're gonna need it. You're gonna make all those costumes. You're seeing a lot of it tonight. The dress I'm wearing is also from Martin. The fabric is from Martin's. Just little Martin's plug there. Keep it local. All right, Mary Lou Barker again. Okay, she's not ready yet. Okay. Well, let's come on ahead. Is Mary Lou coming?
Yes.
Okay, I'll wait for her.
Do you make the patterns from the pictures of the dresses or the patterns available?
There are Regency patterns available. So I do pick here. There's Mary Lou. Mary Lou. Mary Lou's wearing that green silk gown again. This time she's wearing a pelisse that is actually, there is a woman that I know who actually goes and measures extant garments and creates patterns. So this is actually a pattern from an extant garment in a museum. Thank you. Emily de Rispino is wearing a lavender silk gown with a velvet topper. This is Emily's first fashion show. She is the sister of Hannah, who also did her lovely hair. And this, I will say something about this topper she's wearing. We were involved in an estate sale back in New York, and the wife of the gentleman, you look so lovely, Emily, thank you. The wife of the gentleman had a wedding gown from 1920, and this was part of it. And I said, well, I have to save. I mean, the gown was a mess, but that was still in pretty good shape. So I was happy to take it and put it in the show. It's quite a remarkable antique lace piece. Velvet and antique lace, yeah. It's quite stunning. Jean, oh, she's probably still getting ready. Hannah, you might as well come along. Hannah is wearing a pink silk gown with a white satin short Spencer jacket. You know, I've never put those two together, but you are rocking it. This looks great. It's always fun to see your things on somebody else, right? Thank you, Hannah. Beautiful. Let's see who's out there. Jean? Is there anybody out there? Okay. It's that, yeah, this show is more garments changes than a lot of them have had. We have 16 total. So there is a lot of, back and forth. Most of the time I tried to have one dress and then just use different, a pelisse or a jacket so that they wouldn't have to change dresses. But once in a while there's a dress change, so.
How do you store them?
I have a closet that I put them all in. Yeah.
I was thinking caring for them and that you wouldn't want to be ironing. You've got no
Right,
fabric.
right. Once in a while, I clean them out and I donate to Goucher College. Is a friend of the Jane Austen Society of North America. They have an amazing Jane Austen collection, actually, not costumes, but books and first editions and things like that. So they have a department there that enjoys getting costumes. So once in a while, I'll go through them and pack up a few that I've tired of. Because, you only have so much space.
What was the purpose of the petticoat? Was it meant to give bulk to the dress, or was it for warmth?
I think it had a lot of uses. First of all, remember, a lot of the cottons that they used were this very thin lawn cotton. So unless you were quite daring, which some women I'm sure were, you would want to have something under the dress, to, just like today, you want to wear a slip. But also warmth. In the wintertime, they were heavier than the summertime. So I think probably all of the above. Here's Jean Pike wearing a cream gown with a cream lace overlay. I know I like Jean in this mono color.
Is that one of the feathers that started the Audubon Society?
Could possibly be. Yeah.
Some birds were driven to.
Yeah. Feathers were huge. Yeah, feathers were huge. Right up until the Victorian and Gilded Age. Thank you, Jean. Awesome. Mary Post is wearing another one of her creations. Love it. I haven't seen this one yet. This is beautiful. Oh, wow. Fantastic. All right. Periwinkle gown with lavender pelisse. I love the train in the back. And a tall hat. Nice job, Mary. And I know it was not easy. Well, we're glad. We're glad you finished it. Beautiful. Maureen Jennings is wearing the brown silk gown with a voile border print robe to match. See-through prints and border prints were very popular during this period. India was a huge source for fabrics. Mm-hmm. And the hat that Maureen is wearing is called a tall hat, but it's from a company called Shocking Bad Hats, and she does a fantastic job of making Regency style tall hats. And here we have Mary Lou Barker again wearing a green silk gown with a voile gold pelisse.
So that jacket is 2 layers then?
The one she has on is fully lined.
Okay.
Can you open up the pelisse a little bit? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And again, I've never had it with the green dress under it. There's a gold dress that I made to go with it, which also is very pretty, but very nice. I will say that that overlay fabric is curtains.
Oh, it's beautiful.
We get really creative around here. Okay. Hannah DeRespino's where, oh, she's coming out with her sister Emily this time. Cassandra and Jane, here we are. Hannah's wearing a pink silk gown with white, with a, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself here, with a voile robe to go with it. And Emily is wearing the lavender satin gown with a gray and lavender pelisse. They look like they stepped right out of a Jane Austen novel. Beautiful. Silk was definitely popular, if you could afford it. You know, there was China silk, and then, as you saw here, there was English silk as well, which was probably cheaper than imported silk. And they were starting to combine a lot of fibers as well. Like I thought up until actually very recently, until I talked with Hilary Davidson, that it was either wool, linen, silk, or cotton. And there was nothing in between. For the Regency period, it's not true. Apparently, fibers have been being combined for a long, long time. So they might have a wool and a cotton together, or they might have a wool and a satin. They had no polymers. There was no polyester. There was no spandex. Sorry, ladies, we know how we love our spandex. But, you know, they had more available than I think I even realized until recently. So that was quite an eye-opener. Here's Jean Pike wearing a cream gown with a red satin Spencer jacket. She looked beautiful in that. With red satin gloves.
And the tiaras are great. We just happen to have a collection of tiaras.
A few. That's my hobby.
Oh, yeah. You get the tiaras from Martin's?
No. I think that one I bought out in Indiana.
Oh, okay.
I find them everywhere. Beautiful. Our last dress of the evening is Maureen Jennings, who happens to be a volunteer here at the library. So let's give her a round of applause for helping be out with the library. That's very important. She's wearing the brown silk gown with a brown velvet print Spencer jacket and that same shocking bad hat. Yes, she does. Now we're going to bring all our models back for excellent. Here they come. Let's give them a big round of applause. Couldn't possibly do this without them. Are they coming?
It's one long piece of ribbon, twisted around twice, Grecian style.
That was a very popular way of wearing your hair. 'Cause it was very, you know, Grecian style. Any other questions?
Would the bag hats have been more that you wear indoors?
Either. They could be quite ornate, made from all kinds of different fabrics.
Is this all day wear?
No, not necessarily. I would say the dressier gowns could be a combination, depending who you are, what your status is in life. Cotton could be associated with more of a day dress, and then your silks would be the evening wear.